Africa is the birthplace of human writing, but its typographic landscape today is anything but African. When we think of the elements of culture, language is one of the first elements people think of. While people often consider that dialect, accent, vocabulary, and heritage make a culture's language unique, we often forget one crucial element that makes language and writing expressive: typography. Typography is the art of designing and arranging typefaces or fonts to make text legible and aesthetic. Fonts enable writing to display an immense amount of identity, but as with most elements of African society, Africa's typographic culture has been tainted by colonization. So, what happens when an entire continent's visual language is shaped by someone else? The way words are designed influences how we understand them, how we connect with them, and how we interpret the culture from which they come. If language is recorded on paper, there will always be a font attached to it. Even handwriting requires a script and a style. Because typography is woven into everything from signage to books to digital interfaces and political messaging, it becomes one of the most powerful yet often overlooked expressions of cultural identity. In design, type is often the first impression of a message, signaling tone, credibility, and context. If you wanted a design to feel clean and modern, you'd use a sans serif typeface. If you wanted it to feel traditional and wise, you might use an old-style typeface. But what would you use if you wanted a design to feel African? When designers try to communicate an African aesthetic, they quickly discover a troubling reality. The fonts most widely associated with Africa weren't created by Africans at all. Instead, they come from Western imaginations, often reinforcing harmful stereotypes. Fonts such as Neuland, African, and Outlaw are often labeled as African despite having no roots in African visual culture. They rely on exaggerated geometric cuts, distressed edges, or tribal motifs that were never part of any authentic African writing tradition. For example, the font Neuland was designed in Germany as a modern Gothic typeface. Upon its initial release, it was hated by designers, but it was later repurposed as a primitive jungle font in US media. The reputation stuck, and Neuland has since been used in Madagascar, The Lion King, Cool Runnings, and Jurassic World promotional content. These fonts then go on to shape global perception of Africa through Hollywood, creating a damaging cycle. This disconnect between stereotype and reality raises an important question. If these aren't African fonts, then where are the real African typefaces? To understand how we got to where we are now, we have to take a step back and look at the colonial history of African typography that got us to this point. When Africa was colonized by Europe, it was common for the language of the metropole to be adopted by the citizens of the African states, usually not by choice. Today, we see this practice has left a permanent mark on African nations, such as the official language of Angola being Portuguese, Benin, Burkina Faso, and the Congo being French, and many nations speaking English as the national language. What often gets overlooked is that not only did Native Africans have to switch from their native languages to European languages, but they also had to adopt European scripts, specifically the Latin alphabet. African languages that have managed to outlast decolonization are not written in their native scripts, but in the Latin alphabet. This leaves African cultures inevitably lacking in expressive autonomy, even when they use native languages, because they must use a European writing system. To make matters worse, because native African languages need versions of the Latin alphabet with additional African characters, diacritics, and digraphs needed for sounds that don't exist in European languages, they are extremely limited in their font options. less than 5% of fonts offer African extensions, leaving African designers to take what they can get in terms of their font choices. Meanwhile, there are several native African languages that have never had a script to begin with, since they're oral traditions and passed down verbally. This makes them almost impossible to document. Unlike written languages, solely spoken languages are at far greater risk of extinction, because when people who speak the language die, the language dies with them. And with no one left to carry on the oral tradition, the history of that people group will be virtually erased. In Kenya, Stephen Learman is believed to be one of the last fluent speakers of Yakunte, and is trying to keep the oral tradition alive by teaching it to the next generation and recording it in the Latin alphabet.
Learman, not one to resign to fate, made it his life's mission to revive Yakunte, earning himself the title professor among his people.
Saving these oral traditions by adding to pre-existing Latin fonts is still a great service to these communities. But why are so few people designing African fonts? Why isn't this void in the international design industry getting filled? African type designer Chikosu Jobosin presents two critical roadblocks to the African design industry. For one, people tend to be focused more on expanding Eurocentric Latin scripts than on designing fonts that are made purely to express African design. Adding characters to a pre-existing font is a lot easier than designing a font from scratch, and sometimes it only takes a few additions to allow a language of oral tradition to become scriptable. However, we are still left with an African-shaped hole in the font catalog. The African fonts that do exist are usually designed by Westerners and are not reflective of African culture. We see fonts like this used in projects like Black Panther, which uses a font called BEYNO, designed for the movie by Swiss designer Fabian Korn. BEYNO may look like a more genuinely African font, but it's more geometric than anything, and not designed by an African. The font for the Wakandan language itself was designed by California-based typographer Zachary Fannin. Even the Wakandan font is not that African when you break it down. Marque Jamra is a type designer and former professor at Maine College of Art and Design in Portland. In an article from Print Magazine, it says that according to Jamra, the Wakandan alphabet is not just a collection of glyphs from various African systems, but it also consists of frequently occurring shapes that are common across many writing systems, including Nordic runes, Latin, Greek, and ancient Phoenician. What Marque Jamra does is actually a lot more practical for the African design community. Jamra designs fonts for genuine native African scripts, which helps salvage oral history as well as gives African languages an online presence. However, Jamra himself is still an American. Why does it seem like it's always Westerners filling this gap? The second roadblock Jobosin recognizes is that Africans face a lot of barriers to the graphic design industry. There is a general lack of African presence in the design world, and typography is no exception. African-American writer and graphic designer Cheryl D. Miller has noted that Black designers have been historically absent from design education, scholarship, and faculty positions. This absence has created what she calls a curricular void, in which students rarely encounter African design histories or typographic traditions. As a result, Western design becomes the default, while African visual languages remain overlooked, undocumented, and misunderstood. Even without the racial barriers, graphic design is a difficult field for Africans to get into, requiring both a liberal arts education and expensive software. Then, a career as a type designer specifically isn't always profitable, especially if one decides to focus on a niche like African-inspired type, and allow the type to be used en masse and not just for one specific brand. A single font can take years to design, and a script can take decades, making the practice simply too risky and unincentivized for most African designers. This leaves the financially cushioned Western world producing African fonts that are unoriginal, inauthentic, and sometimes even racist. In an interview with Type Electives, Jobosin explained the process for one of his Afrocentric types, Oja Display.
And basically, it's bold, expressive, It's inspired by the anatomical structure of the traditional Oja flutes from eastern Nigeria. And this is how the flute looks like. This is how my flute looks like. So I thought of how I could, take this element or this instrument and, look at the structure and make it into a font, And this was most of the sketch, So it's like, there are tapered corners, a bit of roundiness, all that. Yeah, these were certain explorations on the A and a bit of like the process. And this was the outcome.
Still, other African typographers refuse to accept the Latin script as part of African culture, such as type designer Tapawanishi Sebastian Garikai.
I don't see a reason why we should be, we should still be using the Latin alphabet in this age. Hence, we need to decolonize typography. We need to decolonize that aspect because it's something that came with colonization and missionaries, and it doesn't resonate with us at all. We don't feel any part of any connection at all.
In a lecture with the Type Weekend, he praises the Monwego writing system made for Malawian languages, which took Monwego over 20 years to develop. Yet, the script has struggled to gain traction, particularly due to its lack of fonts and practicality online. Garikai is working to develop more fonts for the Monwego script in hopes that it will increase its use. Meanwhile, him and Mr. Monwego have been working with the government to implement the script in classrooms nationwide.
Scriptures, over 20,000 speakers, people have been taught to write the system by Mr. Monwego, and is trying to work with the government so that it can be incorporated into schools and they can actually start teaching the writing script on a national level. And hopefully by end of this year, something should be up in terms of that in that aspect.
Jobuson and Gary Kai hope that in the future, we will see more fonts compatible with African languages, more fonts using authentic African shape language, and more fonts designed by Africans for Africans. They hope that this will be made possible through the establishment of more type foundries in Africa like Jobuson's Udi Foundry, the investment in art education, and community building among African creatives, so that Africans can have free access to design education without an expensive degree. Africa was the birthplace of writing, but colonization has torn away its typographic identity. Now, these African designers' work reminds us that typography is not just an aesthetic. African typography can reclaim its place as a vibrant force in global design, not as a stereotype, but as a story written by Africans themselves.